So this is an interesting one for me to get as a patron question. It's what happens if Henderson's dream comes true, if the attack on Taranto is a multi-carrier operation. Now, as is normal with my alternate history videos, I'm going to start off by talking about the historical, what happened historically. Now, there are other videos on this channel about Taranto. I did my PhD on the development of naval aviation and carriers, and how carriers and aircraft were symbiotic, as was the doctrine development in sort of that sort of period. And of course, I said a few times on my PhD thesis, I wrote, originally I was going to do it on all three navies. That took the lead, the British, the American, and the Japanese. I ended up writing so much that it ended up just being the British, because that made it down to 110,000 words, which was the absolute maximum word limit I was allowed for my PhD thesis. Yes, they don't allow it to be 180,000 words, do they, Big Fluff? No. So the first things first, before we get into this too much, yes, Henderson was the first Rear Admiral aircraft carriers appointed in the interwar years. He's appointed in 1930. And he's appointed because the Royal Navy in 1930 has decided they're going to be doing multi-carrier operations. They've decided they're going to be doing multi-carrier operations in 1930. Actually, 1926 onwards, realistically, they're working out the idea. It's definitely going to be multi-carriers. And if you're coordinating multiple carriers operating together in a strike group or an operation, you need to have them coordinated by someone. And they toyed around with the idea of having a senior captain doing it, having the commander of the battlecruiser squadron do it, and eventually they decided, okay, Rear Admiral battlecruisers, Rear Admiral aircraft carriers, Vice Admiral battlecruisers was the way they were going at that point. Now, interestingly enough, it does look like it's starting to switch round by about the time you get to 1939. It is starting to change round, but that's mainly the reason they kept the senior officer in the battlecruisers rather than the aircraft carriers was because of the lack of aircraft carriers which could actually accommodate a flagstaff. Yeah, that's a small issue, isn't it, Big Fluff? It is. They couldn't accommodate a flagstaff or support their operation. They had all the radios and everything to command and coordinate the air group and all these things, but you're talking a flagstaff, if you're coordinating multiple carriers and battle cruisers, you're talking a few hundred extra people, honestly, once you've got everyone together. And you need to have accommodations, you need to have all the things for them. You have to look at the issues during World War II Philip Vian has. And the trouble it causes with the carriers he's on as the admiral in charge of the carrier, the carrier group and all their operations, bringing his staff on causes major feathers to be ruffled of, oh, why are we being displaced as staff officers? Why do we not have access to our rooms? Why are we having to double up? Well, because an admiral needs their staff, and you need an admiral to coordinate things, because you can't just go out willy-nilly. You really can't. It doesn't work. But all that is in the future. All that is in the future. With the Royal Navy pushing for a multi-carrier operation, Taranto itself was originally conceived as a multi-carrier operation. It was going to be at least 2 carriers. This question says 4 carriers, and I wouldn't be surprised if it comes from a point I made when I talked about to Wayne Borean, an answering question a while back, which was the Royal Navy's plan for quite a lot of operations, and their operational group of carriers they were looking at was going to be roughly, for every 3 fleet carriers, you're going to have a strike carrier. And that was the kind of force structure they were trying to aim for. And a strike carrier is something like Ark Royal, and a fleet carrier is something like Illustrious. And basically, the differential in role explains their armor scheme and their shaping. But it's basically how to get what you want under the treaty system. Because the Royal Navy knows they're going to have to work in the Mediterranean, they're going to have to work in the South China Sea, they're going to have to work possibly in the North Sea, as well as in the Atlantic, as well as in some of the Pacific, as well as in the Indian Ocean. And the Royal Navy makes the decision, well, we are prepared to trade air group size for air group survivability and carrier survivability. We'd rather have fewer aircraft but have them still available in operations than have more aircraft but have a glass cannon. That was basically their philosophy, because under the limitations, no, it's not 27,000 tons limitation you're working on now. No, it's 135,000 tons limitation, which theoretically limits you to 5 carriers, but 5 carriers is not enough. So that's why you end up with 22,000, 23,000 ton carriers, because despite the fact that you could get armour and air group on 27,000 tons, both the Americans and the Brits know this, you can't get both of them on 22,000 tons, on 23,000 tons, on less. You just can't. You have to sacrifice one or the other. And if you've got space, well, you can trade armour for aircraft. If you've not got space in all your operating theatres, then you're probably trading armour for aircraft. You're probably trading aircraft for armour. That's the reality of it. But the British knew that that doesn't necessarily help them when it comes to strike targets, i.e. harbours, like Taranto. And why are they obsessed with harbours like Taranto? Because a fleet hid from them in a place called Wilhelmshaven for several years, and it was frustrating as anything. And basically, World War II and the intervening years are the Royal Navy excising its various traumas from World War One. They really are. Pretty much it's the same for every Navy in World War II. They're excising their traumas from World War One. And it just carries on. And this is what the Royal Navy's building up for. So they build a strike carrier, because they know they're not going to have enough air group to be the core of a force on a fleet carrier build. They also know roughly what their strike carriers are, and their previous strike carriers are courageous and glorious, with Furious being an honourable mention. So they're the older sort of model strike carriers. Ark Royal's the newer model strike carrier. If you want to see the coming strike carriers, they're things called Implacable class, which are post-treaty and can do both jobs and have the armour. And basically, the Royal Navy would have loved it if Ark Royal and all the illustriouses had all been Implacable-esque 27,000 ton designs. Now, the Implacable 27,000 ton design does get modified. It does. But they're basically using the same route design which comes from the Illustrious class design setup and design study, and they're going with, we're going with a 23,000 ton design? No, we're going with 27,000 ton design. Take off that. Which is why if you go down that same design study, you can find the one which leads to the lovely Unicorn and the light fleet carriers. We'll leave that to one side. So let's consider the operational conception. Now, the conception of the operation to attack Taranto is one of those things which is interesting in its history. And by interesting, I mean there are lots of different stories. You listen to some people, they'll tell you it's born afresh in 1940, and it certainly is refreshed in 1940. Others will tell you it dates itself back to the Abyssinia crisis. And that would certainly be believable if it wasn't for the fact that they already had the details and depths of Taranto Harbour on file, and it documented carefully enough that it was available, that it was easily available without them having to do any prior operation. They already had it in the intelligence documents with the Mediterranean fleet. Okay, you might be going, well, Alex, that seems even further back. You can go back to the fact that the British had started talking about doing attacks on harbours during World War One. They started looking at how to use it. That was a key thing behind the development of Sopwith Cuckoo and things like HMS Eagle and HMS Hermes and HMS Furious's conversions at the time were for these Sopwith Cuckoo operations that were planned. Didn't get to take place, but they were planned on Wilhelmshaven. And after World War One, well, There is even parliamentary committees looking into the subject. There was even a committee named the Harbour, basically the Harbour Attack Committee. It went through various changes and names, but pretty much you get the gist. So the Royal Navy was kind of obsessed with this for quite a while. And then on top of that, you add in Italy became a fascisty power in the 1920s. In the early 1920s. My personal belief is that the Royal Navy was at least information gathering on enemy harbours with relevant data, not just for artillery bombardment, but also for things which would suggest torpedo attack, aerial torpedo attack, from at least the end of World War One. I think it got slotted into the standard information gathering. Whatever information they could get about the depth of harbours they got. If a ship was in harbour and it could do a discrete survey, great. If they managed to, using various means of intelligence gathering, find out the details of a harbour's depth and profile, great. They were getting that information. And again, this is nothing unusual. I'm pretty certain nations and navies are still doing it to this day. It's some of those sort of pieces of information which often are not secret, but are important to be gathered. It's one of those areas of knowledge which you sort of think, well, is it going to be secret? No, because it's too important to commercial and public activities, the depths of harbours, so you can't really make it secret. But it's the sort of information which intelligence services, intelligence branches will be gathering from open source materials and constantly upgrading. I would say the concept of the operation, as in the multi-carrier strike, is probably Abyssinia Crisis. Originally, they are talking about just the carrier, which is in Mediterranean Fleet, Glorious, launching a quick strike. But as time goes on and more forces are attached to the region to deal with the crisis, and more forces are nearby, they do have very quickly go, well, we do have these concepts for multi-carrier operations already sitting around. And it's a very simple operation. It's a night strike. You hit the enemy fleet when they're at harbour, at night, when they are least prepared and least expecting it. And that is a lot of the British planning, realistically. When you start to look at their operational doctrine for their long-range strike, one of the reasons why their aircraft lag behind a bit in terms of technology, we'll say specifically in terms of technology, in terms of their shaping, etc., is very much one of the requests of the Navy to the Air Ministry, because the way aircraft are procured under the dual system in the 1920s and 30s is especially once you have a rear admiral aircraft carriers involved, but it does change a bit, but not much. Basically, the request goes from the fleet to the Admiralty, from the Admiralty to the Air Ministry, from the Air Ministry to the engineering companies, from the engineering companies back to the Air Ministry, from the Air Ministry back to the Admiralty, from the Admiralty back to the fleet. If you're thinking that's complicated, wait until you realise how many departments within the Admiralty and the Air Ministry it goes through as well. It's a nightmare, okay? This is one of the problems you have with this system, whereby the Navy provides the money for the Fleet Air Arm, not for Coastal Command. Theoretically has operational control over the Fleet Air Arm. There's a debate about disciplinary control. That's eventually sorted out just prior to the Inskip Award and the previous award. And has to pay for them, but doesn't have career control even of the naval personnel who are trained as pilots in terms of their promotions and flying rank. which can lead to all sorts of issues of basically your flying rank being different to your rank in the Navy, and that causing theoretical trouble within squadrons because, well, theoretical trouble, it was usually sorted out quite pragmatically. There were ways to structure these things to make it okay. But you could end up with someone who's a lieutenant commander in the Royal Navy being a flying officer in the fleet's air arm, and technically, therefore, coming under the command of someone who's a lieutenant, but is a flying lieutenant in Lieutenant Royal Navy, but a flying lieutenant Royal Air Force. And that can cause interesting circumstances, but it can be dealt with. It was just a complication nightmare. But realistically, that Chinese whisper was combined with the fact that the Air Ministry, well, the Air Ministry gets captured by one of its own factions, its Bomber Command, and they basically deprioritize Fighter Command, Army Command, Coastal Command, Fleet Air Arm, everything which isn't bombers. This is one of the reasons why the RAF is quite so scrambling for stuff and is quite so panicked in terms of its Air Ministry in the late 1930s, because suddenly they're having to fix everything else because they poured all their money in for about 5 years into the bombers, and they've suddenly realised we need to actually be funding all the other things as well. Or rather, the people who are agitating for funding other things finally get their voices heard, and people are going, oh, frigate, we have just been funding one thing, because that was going to solve all our problems. And that was the only thing we needed. And who knows, we actually need a balanced Air Force. You see, I mainly deal with it from the Navy side, and I find it frustrating, because, frankly, the Fleet Air Arm would not have been part of that mess if it had been part of the Navy. But there again, if the Air Ministry had been run properly, and had actually been doing a balanced job, and hadn't been captured by interests within its own service, it would have probably been a fairly good idea. It's theoretically a very good model, but it's kind of like communism in that idea. In theory, communism is a great idea. In practice, it's implemented by humans, which makes it a terrible idea. This is why democracy, which is a far worse idea, but actually deals with humans as they are, turns out to be better than communism at running governments efficiently. Because one has this idea of humans being something different and new and better, and one goes, humans are never going to change, so let's treat them like this. That's the sad truth. And it's the same with the idea of the Air Ministry having controlling development of everything that flies. Theoretically, the Air Ministry are going to be the air eggheads. They're going to be the absolute geeks about it. They're going to give you the very best aircraft. Theoretically, because it's like getting your IT systems designed by someone who is a massive IT geek. You are going to get all the best equipment there, theoretically. But the trouble is that requires them, A, to be thinking about you when they're procuring it and not just about the IT department. And B, that requires them understanding what you need. And that was the other problem the Royal Navy had really problematic with the system, was it was very difficult for the people who were operating to communicate with the aero engineers who were designing the aircraft, because there were a whole lot of pilots in between, and that was a problem. And that's the main difference that changes when the Royal Navy gets control of the Fleet Air Arm after the Inskip Award. And it's the main thing which changes in the Royal Air Force throughout World War II. They suddenly start going, okay, so we need the practitioners to be directly talking to the engineers who are developing these things. Yeah, why didn't we have that system? Oh, because we inherited the Royal Flying Corps system, whereby engineers were dirty things which we didn't want to touch. Oh, yeah. A lot of the problems for the British Armed Forces in the interwar years goes back to the Royal Flying Corps and the way they treated their the way the army treated them. But we'll leave that to one side. That's a whole other area of history. So the conception is this: you're going to have multiple carriers there. You're going to launch a night strike that benefits British aircraft and benefits British doctrine, and it's also going to be a time when the enemy are going to be least expecting it, and it's going to hit. It's going to hit and cause maximum damage. That's a good concept. You can't say no to that as a concept. And then we have HMS Eagle. Now, originally, the plan had involved Eagle. It involved her 18 Swordfish and her 3 Sea Gladiators, as well as Illustrious, carrying 24 Swordfish and 12 Fulmars. Now, why am I saying 24? You know, where are all these Swordfish coming from, for starters? People usually ask, because they go, well, when they combined the groups, they put 24 in Illustrious. They put the 24 best Swordfish available aboard Illustrious. They have more than that from the 2 air groups combined. But also, they are looking at other options. They have Swordfish in crates. They have some... The Swordfish platform is probably the most prolific airframe the Royal Navy has available. And they have lots of them available. Plus, add to that, Swordfish are particularly easy to repair in the field. They were designed to be. Remember when I talked about, you know, what are the design criteria? The Royal Navy's criteria had been ease of operation, ease of maintenance, ease of repair. The ease of operation was specifically true because they want them to fly at night and do night strikes. So they want them as easy to fly as possible, so as much concentration can go on navigation, because flying at night is difficult. Preferably carrying a heavy load, i.e. a torpedo. So that had guided a lot of the Royal Navy's interwar aircraft development process. And the Swordfish really can trace the lineage back to the Sop with Cuckoo. You can really trace the lineage back. You can really trace the design development and the teams involved and the people involved and all the studies and development going forward. So it has had a very long development program, which has made it an incredibly reliable aircraft. And as I've talked about before, the other thing it has is it's probably the most advanced torpedo dropper in the world. That's always a scary thing when I point this out to people, but let me explain why the Swordfish is the most advanced torpedo dropper in the world. It's because of the mechanism it has. You see, the Royal Navy, everyone has been trying with aerial torpedoes to fight the forces of balance, of gravity and buoyancy. Okay? So gravity means when you drop your torpedo, because this bit is heavy, it wants to dive in and go down, which means it goes down deep, which is fine for oceanic attacks, not fine for harbour attacks. Okay, so how do we stabilise this? Well, we try and make this end buoyant if we can, but that can make it go up. Okay, so we add on fins on this end, try and stabilise it, and it's still not working quite well. And the British go, let's go even more nuts. They add in a tension wire, which unspools automatically as the torpedo drops. Which is why the British achieve the successes of operations they do. Which is why 5 out of 11 torpedoes hit their target and only 2 torpedoes actually nosedive and actually drop into the bed of the harbour and never to be seen again. The rest all blow up at various points. But when they have issues, it's due to their detonators, the duplex. It's not due to the issues of the torpedo diving in incorrectly, like the poor Japanese suffer from at Pearl Harbor. And it's poor Japanese from their perspective. It's lucky Americans from their perspective, although looking at the losses, I can understand why people would not think that when saying that. But yeah, if you consider how effective the Japanese torpedoes were, the number launched, if they'd been as capable of belly flopping as British torpedoes were at Taranto, the cost at Pearl Harbor would have been far, far greater. You have that level of successful torpedo operation at Pearl Harbor, that cost goes way up. So, you have a lot of Swordfish running around. You even have Swordfish seaplanes, float planes, being used by various ships, which can be readily converted back into normal deck planes if necessary. There are plenty of airframes around to have a full air deck. So the original strike would have been 21 Swordfish per wave. Not 12 per wave, 21. And it was going to be 3 carrying flares, 6 carrying bombs, and 12 carrying torpedoes per wave. Now this gets changed around when you drop down to 24, it really does. Because you drop from 42 aircraft to 24 aircraft. And that's a big drop. You also drop from 2 flight decks to 1 flight deck, which makes it interesting from a recovery perspective and also a launching perspective. But the original plan is a 2-striker, a 2-wave, 2-carrier strike. With a little bit under twice as many aircraft involved as were historically involved. Would have been interesting to see. But unfortunately, Eagle, because they only have 2 carriers in the training, when she had some issues with a near hit or miss of a bomb, instead of them taking her in, doing a proper refit and fixing her fuel system and all the things which were having issues, they jury-rigged it to keep going, and then unfortunately it collapses just before this operation is supposed to be done, so she's no longer viable. That's the problem. You have lots of operations which are requiring 2 carriers because it's best to have 2 carriers. British doctrine is to always deploy 2 carriers when you can. Why? Because the duplication of flight decks gives you added security in case of damage. So if one carrier gets damaged, you can still refuel, rearm aircraft and launch fighters up. You can still keep the continuous fighter presence going in the sky while you're repairing the other flight deck. The British are all about survivability of force, and that is where a lot of their multi-carrier operational doctrine comes from. Survivability of force doctrine, survivability of strike doctrine, survivability of operations doctrine. The British are very much of the belief it's better to have something operating always than to have a lot of something and then having nothing. So they are really focused around that kind of operation, which gives them a slightly different style of multi-carrier operation than what is conceived by the Americans or is conceived by the Japanese. They're all slightly different. They're similar. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of similarities between them. But the minor differences come from their differences in original reasoning for why they are going down the multi-carrier route. Each has their own reasoning for it. For the Japanese, it's to coordinate their strikes because of their plan of attritional operations. For the Americans, it's to coordinate their strikes for the plan of offensive scouting operations and how they're going to raid on the enemy and cause maximum damage. For the British, it's about survivability of the carrier battle group, of the carrier group, and of the carriers as a force in any operations. Because the British, one of the reasons why they get today is because not in the Mediterranean, South China Sea, but the fact is the South China Sea operations against Japan would be the other side of the world from Britain. They'd be the other side of the world. So anything which goes wrong out there, if it really needs a proper fixing, has got to come all the way back to the UK to be fixed and then go back. So you want it to be as survivable and as easy to fix as possible, as forward as possible, so that you can fix it easily. And only the things which really need fixing have to be brought back to the UK. Because, let's be honest, whilst there are some facilities in Australia, there are some facilities in Singapore, there are some facilities in India, they're not the heart of the British industrial complex. They're not the heart of the British Empire's industrial capabilities. And as good as they are, their governments haven't exactly invested in them. Not that British government's been doing a lot of investing, but they had more to begin with. So that's how they're scraping by. Let's consider, therefore, now the operation itself. Now, Operation Judgment, i.e. the attack on Taranto, was part of a wider operation called Operation MB8, which include Operation Coat, Operation Judgment, of course, and various manoeuvres of forces. In fact, the whole objectives for it was to reinforce the Mediterranean Fleet by Force F, proceeding from Gibraltar and carrying stores for Malta, Operation Coat. to attack the Italian battle fleet in Taranto harbour with all available TSR aircraft from Illustrious and Eagle, operating from Illustrious, Operation Judgment. And this is, by the way, in the summary, the final summary objectives. The pre-operation, pre-Eagle being damaged objective was going to use all available aircraft from Eagle and Illustrious, both operating, to carry out a raid with light forces in the Straits of Taranto on enemy convoys to Albania. This leads to a whole different fun thing. You see these lines going up here into the Straits of Taranto. The fact is, the British light cruisers and destroyers end up attacking a convoy on their way out. So an Italian merchant convoy, escorted, is attacked by British warships coming out of the Adriatic. Do you have any idea how much trauma that causes the Italians? I mean, it's a whole thing. I've done a whole videos on it in the past on the operation. It is an absolutely scary operation, but it's something the British are going to repeat again and again. There is the Battle of Cape Bon later on in the war, where Royal Navy destroyers attack two Italian light cruisers from the Italian shore of the side of the Mediterranean, and the Italians go, "But why are you attacking from behind us? You weren't looking that way, so we came and attacked you from this way." It's a constant thing for the Italians throughout the war. Every time they turn their back, the British are there. And trust me, the Italians get their own revenge. The things they do in Alexandria Harbour, etc., they do get their own revenge. Both sides have their own brand of how they're going to punk the other, and they do it. And finally, to cover the passage of convoys between Egypt, Malta, Crete and Greece. So that's a small list of objectives. The force involved: Force A, Battlefleet, Warspite, Valiant, Malaya, Illustrious, Gloucester, York and 12 destroyers. Force B, Ajax and Sydney, carrying troops and guns to Suda Bay. Force C, Orion, carrying Royal Air Force to Athens. Force D, Convoy Escort Force, Ramleys, Coventry, Calcutta, 6 destroyers and 3 escort vessels. Force F, Reinforcements, Barham, Glasgow, Berwick and 4 destroyers. Convoy MW3 from Alexandria, 5 merchant ships for Malta and 5 for Suda Bay. Convoy AN6 from Port Said, 7 merchant ships for Athens. And it carries on. Convoy N3 from Malta, 4 merchant ships for Alexandria, and 1 destroyer for their escort. Plus, I think there's a cruiser as well with them. And then there's another convoy as well of merchant ships for from Athens for Port Said. This is the normal thing. This is what's normally going on. This is what's going on all around it. And they have all the plans put together. They have everything worked out. And, by the way, ADM 1/11030, the Operational History and Assessment, I think it's number 5, which this comes from, is a really interesting after-action report and discussion of the various bombing systems and methodologies that can be used for the attacks and how they did and all sorts of things to read. It's a really worthwhile document to read, and if I can get a copy at some point, I will do. But as said, I have done a full rundown of this mission before on other videos, so I'm going to give you a quick overview of the operation. It's a quick overview of the operation, but there should also be, if I have programmed it right, a link appearing here, which is a full video about literally this operation, with it in as fulsome detail, every book, everything I could get, because the thing is, that's about, I think, roughly an hour and a half video on its own, and this is a video which is going into a multi-carrier alternate history, so I didn't want to make it an hour and a half literally on this bit, because then I'd have to do an hour and a half on the next bit to make sure they're balanced, and that ends up with a 3-hour video, which I know from my own stats, when I do 3-hour videos like that, the average person watches 20 minutes of it. if I do a 90-minute video, the average person watches 45 minutes to an hour. It depends on how well it has been in between. When I do a 5-hour brew ships, the average person watches 2.5 hours of it. These are the differences which I observe, so I adjust accordingly. To try and hopefully provide something which as many people as possible take as much information from as possible. Because that's why I'm here. I want to spread the joy and interest of naval history as far and wide as possible. With that being said, the timeline for the Battle of Taranto, and you have to remember, please, that any aircraft fitted with torpedoes had to have the in-cockpit long-range fuel tank fitted. And these long-range fuel tanks were fitted into the aft cockpit, which was a two-person cockpit. They'd be fitted into the middle position, which is normally the observer, aka navigator / professional naval officers prior to the fleet era, on joining the Royal Navy seat. And they would move back into the telegraphist air gunner's seat at the back and take on that role as well as navigating. Those tanks came with an added bonus. This aircraft, which they'd spent so much giving it such a precise system of torpedo dropping, had these fuel tanks which leaked, and so quite a lot of the observers, not the pilots, the observers, when they were flying into Taranto Bay under attack by AA fire, which was tracer and everything reaching up to the sky to take them out, were waist deep in aviation fuel. So, anytime someone wants to put out a competition for who are the bravest, most insane people to ever go into combat, I have a naval submission which people often overlook. All the observers who flew in over Taranto waist deep in aviation fuel. Let's be honest, there are stories out there which are equally brave, but there are very few which I would definitely never be doing that. I'm sorry. I don't think there is anything you could pay me which would make me want to do that. Just waist deep in aviation fuel. The most combustible of the fuels. Yes. No. Anyway. The British launched 21 out of 24 Swordfish they had aboard. And, well, the base at Taranto was defended by 101 AA guns, plus some nearly 200 machine guns. Usually had many, we're talking nearly 100 barrage balloons, but 27 were in place on the 11th of November, as strong winds on the 6th had taken out 60 of them, which had assisted the British. Capital ships were also supposed to be protected by anti-torpedo nets, but, well, of the nearly 13 kilometres of netting required for full protection, that's roughly 42,000 feet. Less than a third was actually rigged before the attack because they'd scheduled a gunnery exercise. And furthermore, the nets were quite shallow. And in quite a few places, the British torpedoes could actually, at their running depth, pass on them and still hit the ships. Because you have to remember, the British torpedoes are supposed to be duplex, so they can either go off if they bash into the side of the ship, or go off if they go underneath the ship. They're just not having a good day, the Italians. The Reggio Marina's not having a good day. The first wave launch was 12 aircraft, 6 armed with torpedoes, 4 with bombs, 2 with flares. And the next one to take off was 9 aircraft. 3 aircraft weren't serviceable. And they were fairly torpedo heavy, 5 with torpedoes. But this is a good force going in. And when they get over the Italians, they get ferocious fire. They really do. They get so much fire going up that every single plane thinks it's the only one to be there. It's the only one to survive when they're getting back. And they all, pretty much all the accounts talk of the shock when they get back to the ship and they land on Illustrious. There's no aircraft on deck. And you know there's going to be no aircraft on deck, but you're expecting some damage, some heavily damaged aircraft to be positioned on deck, not taken down a hangar maybe, or maybe even some wreckage from other aircraft landing, but there's nothing on nothing on deck. And so you're looking back, the pilot and observer are looking back, and there's going to be no radio communications from the ship because it's night. They've got lights up and systems to guide you in, but they are not doing radio communications because they're not revealing their position to the enemy or to you. So you have to guide yourself in on them using the beacon, etc. And you're looking at each other, and they're the only two people, they can only talk to each other for that bit, and then they get taken to the lift, and the aircraft's put on the lift. The wings are folded in, and they're being lowered down, and that's when, in the lights inside the hangar shining brightly, they suddenly see all these aircraft. And they realize that they aren't the only ones who survived. And almost every account is like that, especially from the second wave. The first wave, there's a few accounts from the people who are the first pilots back, who really weren't expecting anyone to follow them, and their account is watching the people, because they are kept down in the hangar deck. They're kept in that area, watching them as they're coming in, and seeing their friends arriving. As it is, the attack does cause quite a chunk of damage. It's a night strike. It's a night strike where they leave, the first wave leaves at roughly 2100 hours. 9 o'clock. They hit the Mar Grande, the harbour at Taranto, at roughly 2300 hours. And what do they hit? Well, Conte de Cavour gets hit once. And that creates a 39-foot by 26-foot hole in the hull. That's 12 meters by 8 meters. That's well, to be honest, when I was thinking about it, it's the size of pool my primary school had. Roughly 12 meters by 8 meters. And that always felt like a massive pool when I was learning to swim at the age of 3. That, as a hole in the ship, is not good. That is not good. And she is, well, she's still undergoing repairs when Italy surrenders, so she never returns to full service. Giulio, well, she gets an 11 by 7 meter, that's a 36-foot by 23-foot hole, and again is saved by running her aground. Conte de Cavour had actually been held back for longer than she should have been, because they kept withdrawing, not giving her permission to run her ground. And that's possibly what cost her as much damage as it did. And then Littorio. Littorio is hit 3 times. 3 torpedo hits. And if we go to this slide, which I haven't already discussed because, frankly, it isn't as descriptive as the latest slide I have, so I'm not sure if I'm going to use it. You can see the layout of the ships, you can see their positioning, you can see where there are supposed to be netting and things out to protect them, which aren't properly in place. You can also see the space the aircraft have to attack, the maneuvers they make. And the British have very good, very up-to-date information about all of this. And that's what really makes the difference in this operation. Now, they had worried. They had severely worried that 21 aircraft, well, 24 aircraft weren't going to be enough. The actual originally, as said, the British plan was 42 aircraft. Using 24, there was severe worry there wouldn't be enough to actually do anything, and all they do is reveal that they could do this, make the Italians mad, and not get anything for it. Now, what they actually get is a few months' peace. A few months' peace. Not much, but a few months' peace. And that's sometimes enough. The idea that this operation wipes out the Italian Navy and they don't come to sea again, or this combined with Matapan, I was like, no, they don't. They do establish a strength for the British. They do allow the British to better manage the Italian threat. And you always have to remember the Reggio Marina is a major threat. They are a capable force, and when properly used, they are very, very scary. Luckily, politicians often made sure they weren't being properly used. But leaving that to one side, this strike, considering you're using 21 aircraft, you cripple three of their battleships out of 6 in the harbour. That's good. You do some light damage on some of the light cruisers and some of the other things as well, but you know, honestly, if you wanted bombs, you needed to take skewers. You needed to take the dive bombers. And the British do not realise this. There are discussions for plans which involve HMS Ark Royal not doing her operation, which is another. As part of MB8, she's also doing an operation where she's doing a distraction by attacking elsewhere, and there's all sorts of things going on. But realistically, for what they're putting in, they are getting a lot out. For what they're putting in, they're getting a lot out. For what they could have got in for putting in 42 aircraft, well, 5 out of 11 torpedoes fired hit their targets. If you're taking in 42, and let's say you still have 3 or 4, let's say 6 of the aircraft don't operate. Let's just go as worst case scenario. And that means you're dropped down to, what? 36? Well, the odds are you're taking at least 20 torpedoes in on that strike. At least 20 torpedoes. If you do get 42, if by some miracle you got all 42 available and operating, you probably are, well, as I already discussed earlier, you're taking in 12, 6, and 3, so you're taking in 24 torpedoes. I'd say upping that to saying 10 torpedoes hit their targets is not me being out of the realms of possibility. In fact, I'd say I'm underestimating on the level, but there are reasons not to. If you're trying to, you're never going to hit the Giulio Cesare. You're just not. I have done it many times. With the way the British are attacking, the only way they could hit the Giulio Cesare is if they're bringing skewers and all they do is target the Giulio Cesare and they literally hammer it. They're bringing 24 skewers, they all hammer the Giulio Cesare, then they have a chance of sinking that ship. Otherwise, you're not getting a torpedo on it. But again, if we go back to this scenario, you can see there are options. There's the Vittorio Veneto, which is in a very interesting position. There is. And if you get some more torpedoes hitting the Littorio, hitting the Conte de Cavour, hitting the Giulio, well, those ships could be knocked out permanently. 10 torpedoes rather than 5 hitting targets. Well, this is what 5 hits do. They knock 3 ships out for months on end. 1, she's not repaired before the war's over for the Italians. 10 torpedoes hitting. That's going to cause a lot more trouble. That is going to cause a lot more trouble. With that being said, though, it is now time for the Shameless Book Plug. So, Shameless Book Plug, where I say thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, and supporting this channel. Now, I want to talk about something here, not just about my book, and thank you for doing it. Thank you for the people who buy my book and all those things. It really does help and really is a nice thing. But I also want to talk about the books I've used today for the alternate history and where I've been grabbing information from. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to do this out really quickly. We have Ray Sturvint's Squadrons of the Fleet of the Air Arm. It's a very, very good book for finding out information of what squadrons were doing what where. Fleet Air Arm aircraft units and ships 1920 to 1939, if you want to have a rough idea for what the Royal Navy has available and how frigging many stockpiles of different aircraft types, especially TSR types, they have sitting around various places. I'm still surprised that they're only the oldest aircraft they're really using quite a lot is the Swordfish. There are very free F stockpiles sitting somewhere as well in Fenderson. This is good, useful. We then have both editions of Norman Freeman's British aircraft carriers in two World Wars. And his older one, the British Carrier Aviation. Now, normally disappoint where I'd say there's also a link below to my PhD thesis. It should be out soon. It's supposed to be out. It might even be out by the time this video goes live. Who knows? It's been waiting for years to go up on the site, and it will go up on the site as soon as it can do. Now, I don't know. It's fun. It's fun. All these academic things. Anyway, thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you for helping it become what it's become. Hopefully when this video goes out, there'll be advertisements for the Japan trip, which will be the Shipshade trip coming up, and I'll be knee-deep organising that and trying to communicate to museums and making sure everything is confirmed and hoping there are no miscommunications of language going on. I want it to go well so badly. I really want it to be a good trip because it might be, for a while, the last trip Shipshape do for a while. Mainly because we're all getting so busy. I have a house to set up once the mortgages and everything is sorted out. Drac has kids. We have a big conference coming up. I'm not sure if we'll be able to do another of these history trips for a while. But I want them to all be good, because they've been so good so far, thanks to you, thanks to meeting all of you when we're out there. It's something I really look forward to. I really love the history we get to see. I really love the history we get to share. I really love the people we get to meet, and it's all possible thanks to you. Everything we do is possible thanks to you, so thank you for that. And for those who need a reminder, after the Shameless Book Plug, we now deal with the alternate history. So if you don't like alternate history, go away now. Okay? I have put enough reminders in this video. I do this enough times. If you don't like it, don't watch it. If I get comments below, you had alternate history, I didn't like it in this video, I will just put a laughing emoji response to you. I really will. Because I tell you, I do this every single time. I do the history first, and then I do the alternate history after the Shameless Book Plug, and I always say it's coming. So if you don't like alternate history, why are you still watching? It's not on me at this point. At this point, you are willingly subjecting yourself to it, so don't complain to me about it. It's on you. Okay? But do expect also, for those people who do want to watch the alternate history, there's going to be a lot of information about British multi-carrier operations and the theory at the time, because, well, they didn't get to use the theory much in World War II, thanks to losses of Courageous and Glorious, and also Ark Royal, but we'll leave that later on, and the fact that Winston Churchill came in and implemented 1914's plan of pause the capital ships, and pause the cruisers, and pause the carriers he added on as well. Because we need to rapidly build escorts, and it took him about 6 months to be convinced that they'd already ordered all the escorts. And then he busily goes off and eventually writes a post-war history. And this, I like Churchill. I actually think he does it. He's the right person for the job as Prime Minister and all these things. But compared to the other options, he is by far the better option available of actual viable options. But I do not like the way he rewrites history as to, I come in and I get all these things organised. They'd been organised and been running for 2 years. The Royal Navy was procuring on a plan of war beginning by 1942. They'd placed the orders. The airships were going to take roughly 18 months to build, get into service, and that meant if they ordered them in 1939, they'd be ordered with 18 months to spare for 1942. The government had ended the 10-year rule in 1932. They'd actually ended the funding. The funding had actually been freed up in 1937. The Royal Navy preparing for war in 1942 is all it can prepare for because it's finally got the money. And the first things it needs to sort out are the long lead items and the really expensive bits, and then it can start sorting out the cheaper stuff. It's very simple. It's actually doing pretty darn well on the timescale it was given. It's just the timescale it was given was out by 3 years. Now, realistically, in terms of alternate history, there are 2 routes you can go down in this scenario. Either Courageous and Glorious, don't get lost, or Formidable is commissioned in September 1940, somehow, about 2 months earlier than she is historically. And instead of launching a diversionary strike, Ark Royal also transfers to the Eastern Mediterranean with the fleet being rushed across to take part in the strike. Leaving the Western Mediterranean without a carrier temporarily, but there again, if you're chucking everything into a strike. And the thing is, this is a possibility. This is a possibility. You basically have Formidable and Ark Royal as a pair charging across to join up with an Eagle and an Illustrious. Now, I would say the more likely option for getting there is also hybrid scenarios where you go, well, either Courageous or Glorious isn't lost and are out in the Mediterranean as the third carrier, because they do reckon they need a third carrier out there, which would also explain why Eagle is actually in good maintenance, and then Formidable or Ark Royal is the fourth. You can do it that way. There are differing options. Realistically, the easiest way, probably, is to just go Courageous, not lost. Because she's lost to a torpedo. And you could just have the torpedo damage her instead of sink her. And so she's then in maintenance and repair for a bit, which would explain why she's not around for the rest of the war. And then she's made ready and she and Ark Royal dash across. There are options for this. There are options for how we do this and for how we approach this. And I did spend a lot of time considering this all through. I really did. And ultimately, what I decided was we either go down the Glorious and Courageous Survive route, or we go down the Formidable and Ark Royal route. And the reason I decided to go that way, rather than doing all the different permutations you could do to get enough of these vessels out there, is because that is what fits overall with the pattern of the war most. So if Glorious is not lost to Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, if she's either not given permission to go without sailing the rest of the fleet, or if she's sailing with cruisers which have rear admirals aboard who would be going, what the frigate are you doing? Why is there no aircraft airborne? Well, I don't care. Aircraft airborne for record. That's a standard operating procedure. Please get some aircraft up. We're escorting royals here. There's scenarios for that. As for Courageous, again, she just doesn't get sunk by the torpedo, and let's say it hits her in a less vital spot. She doesn't get as much damage. she managed to get repaired and put into service. The Mediterranean is a very sensible place to send these ships. They are useful there. They can carry a very useful complement of aircraft. Probably it's going to be swordfished heavy. Probably we're talking about 36 swordfish each and roughly 12 full Mars, but we'll talk about air group as we go on. And it's very sensible. The other option is that Formidable is commissioned in September 1940. She's completed a couple of months early. And then she joins the fleet which is being sent out to there with a new air group aboard, probably new aircraft. And Ark Royal goes with her because they decide to make it a 4-carrier strike. Now the thing is, if they decide to make it a 4-carrier strike and everything's dependent on it being 4 carriers, then hopefully they're carrying more spare parts for aircraft so they can get all their aircraft operating. And in both these scenarios, the larger operating scenarios of aircraft probably mean they do have fuller strikes because they'll have more spare parts and they'll have more maintainers, and aggregately will be able to generate more aircraft. It's mass creates mass usually when we're talking about operations. And well, if you do transfer them across, you end up with a fairly heavy strike force. A fairly heavy and fairly capable strike force. Now, if you think this one through, so we look at this. You get some really interesting numbers. You have the older ships involved. You have 114 swordfish, 36 Fulmar, 3 Sea Gladiators. Okay, but if you have it being Ark Royal and Formidable, well, the odds are you're going to get the first 24 Albacore deployed. Because again, if I'm building a group for Formidable in roughly August, September 1940, well, historically, 826 and 829 Squadron, when they form up for Formidable, are the first to operate Albacores from an aircraft carrier. And 826 had been formed in March 1940, so it makes sense that they would be the aircraft chosen. So you get skewered dive bombers, which are still operating on Ark Royal for quite a while. And she's got a squadron of full Mars, a squadron of skewers, and 3 squadron of swordfish at this point. Formidable will bring a squadron of full Mars and roughly 3 squadrons of Albacores. And please note, I'm saying roughly, and I'm using the figures are roughly. In terms of availability, you can't predict. In this scenario, if you've got this many more aircraft coming in, this many more spare parts coming in, the way the ships will work in terms of sharing spare parts, sharing fitters when they need to get aircraft operational, it's going to change things. If you consider between Illustrious and Eagle, there was a lot of sharing of personnel going on. There was a lot of spare parts going back and forth as they were needed in between land bases. Add in extra carriers, you're going to turbocharge this. Even with the ships at sea. They will. It's not just them flying to Malta, picking up reconnaissance information and loading their swordfish up with potatoes and flying back. They're also sometimes flying between carriers with spare parts in them. You know, the swordfish are very useful for that kind of operation and that kind of thing. And there's also boats and things they can use to move stuff back and forth. And they do all this. So you get a very different scenario. That's the first thing. This is closer to the scenario which the British would like to do. Remember, 24 for them was small. 42 was something which they were considering was a bit small. This is more getting up to the figures which they would like to see in these strikes. And the thing I think you're going to have to note on this one is that it's probably going to be about 3 waves. Again, there's a reason for that. How many aircraft do you want going in the darkness at night if they're going to be manoeuvring and striking? Do you want to crowd the sky too much and crowd their room for manoeuvre by having too many aircraft? Would you like to have the things coming in over multiple strikes, multiple times? Knowing the British policy and the British doctrine, this kind of force, if you're dealing this size, is going to be split up into roughly 3 strikes. It is going to be split up into 3 strikes, but each of those strikes are going to be collectively, as a strike, are going to be individually stronger than the collective strength of the strike actually historically flown against Taranto. It also makes sense from a forming aircraft up perspective and a launching aircraft perspective. If you're trying to group together multiple strikers from multiple carriers, you don't want to have them up there waiting, whirling, circling around and trying to form up for too long. So if you do them in roughly half-hour blocks of first wave, second wave, third wave, it makes sense. I would also say with this strength, you're going to get something else in this scenario. Fulmars are going to be part of the strike package. Historically, they weren't, because they didn't want to risk them, because they didn't have enough for their air defense operations if they lost any. That was their worry. But again, you've gone from 12 and 3 Sea Gladiators, which were shoehorned, to having 36 Fulmars. So I think you can risk probably about 12 of them. And the reason I say 12 is because that means for each of your waves, you can shift the flare dropping, which is what Fulmars could be used for, the flare dropping duties and the machine gunning of barrage balloon duties onto Fulmars, which they will be very happy to do and very good at doing. And that means you can then focus your strike aircraft more on strike. You don't have to have any assigned to flare dropping. This starts to make this force even more deadly. It's incremental, but it adds up. It all adds up. And adding up is what it will work out to. Because then we get to the strikes, therefore, in this timeline. And what I'm thinking they are going to be looking like. And originally, it's 21 out of 24 make it. Originally organised with 12 torpedoes, 8 with bombs and 4 with flares, split evenly over 2 waves. It's then, of course, reduces down. But you have in this scenario, and I'm not sure why. Let me just update that. It says 8. It says 9 albacores in each wave, and it would have been, of course, 8. So I must have mistyped that one. That's better. So you'd have each wave consisting of 4 Fulmars. Probably, as said, they would be loaded with flares. 26 Swordfish, 8 albacores, 4 Skewer, or full Fulmars, and 38 Swordfish. Now, this actually does have some differentials, because I'd say with the Skewers and the albacores taking on bombs, and I think the albacores will be loaded with bombs, not torpedoes, because again, night strike operations, aircraft, you want aircraft they're familiar with, you want to go reliable, they are going to focus on them carrying the torpedoes. The Swordfish are going to get the torpedoes, not the albacores. And to me, that means if you consider the number of strike aircraft you have of 38 aircraft, you'd be probably talking about the Swordfish carrying roughly 20 of the Swordfish carrying torpedoes in each wave. So 6 would still be carrying bombs. They could all go for all 26 Swordfish armed with torpedoes, but they probably go for roughly 20. And when you consider the 38 Swordfish and full Fulmars, again, you probably go 20, 22 loaded, maybe even 24 actually, thinking about it. But well, I could set off at 22 as it's it's in the middle of the range. 22 loaded with torpedoes, and the remaining 16 loaded with bombs. And that's a very different scenario. This is a very different scenario. This does fit with British doctrine. It's divided up into strikes of roughly, and it should be noted, roughly 40 aircraft, which is about the maximum they like for a combined night strike at this point, according to their theory of operations, roughly. And I am saying this roughly because, honestly, the surviving documents around this and information around this are scarce. So what we have mostly are notes from people involved at various points that have been survived, and various notes written down from various pilot sources and observer sources, etc., and people writing them down and writing down their ideas. So when we say this, we are going with, well, roughly that seems to be their doctrine. And also, if we look at their planning details and how they're planning operations, that seems to be what they're going for. If in this scenario, you wouldn't be organizing strikes of 20 aircraft or 12 aircraft. That doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. That's what you do if you've got a single carrier. You've got 4 carriers. So roughly the rule is it's a squadron per carrier, which gives you roughly 40 to 48 aircraft. That's the rough rule of thumb they seem to be operating on when they're doing night exercises, etc., and they're trying to form strikes up. That's roughly what they're doing. And then you go, okay, right. So if you've got this as your options, either way, you're going to have a lot more torpedoes, And this is when things get interesting, because if you're talking roughly 60 torpedoes, let's say, and that's in the first strike, it's 60 torpedoes. In the subsequent one, in the other option, it's 66 torpedoes. Well, let's go for 25 hits. That's actually below the percentage achieved. That's below the percentage achieved. I should be saying, if it's 66 torpedoes, I should be saying 30 hits. 30 torpedoes hit. If it's 60 torpedoes, I should still probably be saying more than 25 hits. But I'm being as conservative as I can be, and I've done some stats work on this. And I'd say 25 fits, okay? If we consider the damage that 5 did, and we've already thought about the damage that 2 carriers and 10 torpedoes hitting might have achieved. Well, thinking about the scenario where you achieve 25 torpedoes hitting, that suddenly becomes a very different scenario. Now, I do think in that scenario, you're probably going to get some torpedoes targeted at the cruisers. I do. But I also think you cannot avoid that some of those ships which got a single hit are probably going to get a couple of hits. The Torio might get another hit, but also some of the other exposed battleships might get hit themselves. And this is the point we need to start talking about, the likely results. And this is where things can get really interesting, because as good as the Pugliese system is, as good as it is, as the Regia Marina's anti-torpedo system for their battleships is, not all their ships have it, and it's not designed to deal with the sheer quantity of torpedoes that are going to be chucked at them. And that's me being, as said, very conservative about the number of these being deployed. If we consider historically the aircraft there are 2 aircraft lost in the strikes, and the Italians fire nearly 13,500 shells. 13,500 shells are fired. They have searchlights, but they don't turn them on for fear of illuminating themselves and illuminating their own ships. Also, there's also the flares already going up, so I presume they think, frigate, why add to the illumination out here? We're just going to make things easier for the aircraft to hide in the contrast. But the other problem for the Italians is going to be, if you look at the density of the firing, the second wave is still probably going to suffer the most from the number of shells in the air, because by that time they're sighted in. The third wave, they're going to be running low on ammunition. They were running low on ammunition. The first wave, they were caught by surprise. The first wave does quite a lot of nasty hits. If we consider the strikes and the ships hit, and this slide is, this drawing is better because it does actually have the names on there. You can see how the Giulio Cesare is very difficult to line up on if you're coming around the defences. If you're trying to come around the netting, this was the other thing that the Royal Navy aircraft managed to do, the Swordfish pilots managed to do, is navigate themselves round the netting, as you can see from some of their tracks, and focus their torpedoes in. You've got the Giulio. That is probably going to get hit at least another couple of times. Look at its position. It's going to be right in the front of center. And that stops people being able to line on upon the Cesare from that angle. You've then got the Littorio and the Vittorio Veneto. They are pretty exposed in the position they are in. They're going to get slammed into. You can see where the flare-dropping aircraft are coming in. They are flying behind. They are the sort of red line with these, you can see these lights coming off them. That's where the flares are being dropped. That's what the flare aircraft are doing. They're dropping the flares behind the enemy ships, behind the Regia Marina ships for the attacking aircraft. So they are silhouetted, and so the attacking aircraft are in darkness, comparatively. It makes it harder for the Italian AA gunners to actually engage the Royal Navy aircraft because of where the flares are going off. In this scenario, there's more flare aircraft. There's not 4 flare aircraft, there's 12 dropping flares. It's going to be like blooming daytime behind the Italian fleet. You've got the Conte de Cavour, where she's hit. The Doria behind her is also in a pretty protected position, but again, she is likely to get hit by more aircraft coming around. And then you've got the Gosina, the Zara, and the Fiume. You have 25 torpedoes. And there are 8 good targets. If they get between 2 and 4 torpedoes each, hitting each, the thing is, that's going to lead to some of these things being sunk. They're going to be lost in the harbour. They're going to go completely underwater. If you look at how the Italian port facilities were overloaded, dealing with the original damage, dealing with this much more damage, this much greater losses, they're going to be in real trouble. And I have no doubt the Italians are going to put up a good fight. This was a very good fight by the Italians. It's just, for one operation, pretty much everything that could go right for the British went right for the British. This was a meticulously planned, meticulously executed operation, doing something which the British have been practicing and thinking about doing for the previous 20 frigating years. In simple terms, if the British hadn't pulled this off, there would have been a problem, and heads should and would have rolled. So that is what we're dealing with. The British got to carry out a set-piece operation in a set-piece scenario that they had been practicing, thinking about and planning for 20-odd years. And they got to do it with aircraft which were absolutely perfect for the job, as they conceived it. Now you notice I haven't covered much about what bombers get up to, because I'm not sure how well the bombers do. Still, even if you have more bombers, what's the impact? Do skewers go after Giulio Cesare? Do they go after the battleships? Or they go after the Mar Piccolo, the cruiser in Mar Piccolo again? I'm not sure. They're probably going to go after targets of opportunity. They might, if they've got the skewers, go, we want you to take out the fuel dumps. They might. There are options for all of that. And that's, again, going to magnify the damage, magnify the issues. I think in this scenario you are very unlikely to see the Italians getting away without having pretty much everything other than Giulio Cesare damaged to the point at which they're non-operational. They are going to need work to recover. Absolute sinkings. Anything which they don't manage to beach quickly enough is probably going to go down. And considering how close it got with the Conte de Cavour, because they're focusing quite sensibly on the Littorio, I think if they've got the Littorio and the Vittorio Veneto to worry about, and probably the cruisers as well, then the older dreadnoughts might well suffer and might well go deeper and might well submerge deep enough that, frankly, even if you do recover them, the water damage means they are pretty much scrap. There is a scenario in this where the Italians end up with Giulio Cesare as their only viable battleship for the next 12 months because of the damage suffered. Littorio and Vittorio Veneto will be brought back into service. They will be. Littorio was managed to be brought back into service, and she historically got 3 massive hits. You can see these hits. They caused huge amounts of damage. But I could see it very, very likely as, well, the other ships don't get back into service. They don't get brought back because they don't have the... It's not so much they don't have the resources. They don't have the time. They don't have the facilities to do it. And if you don't have those ships available, that is going to change things. That is going to change operations. The Battle of Cape Spartivento is going to be a very different scenario. In the nicest way, the Battle of Cape Spartivento traditionally involves 2 Italian battleships, of which Giulio Cesare was one of them, Vittorio Veneto was the other. I don't think the Battle of Cape Spartivento, if you've just got Giulio Cesare, and also if you're down 3 heavy cruisers, if you're down Fiume, Goza, and good old Zara there. Admittedly, they weren't part, historically, of the Battle of Spartivento. It was only Gyozo and Fiume, but if you're down to 4 heavy cruisers and 1 battleship, and it's an older battleship, do you actually go out to fight the Battle of Cape Spartivento? Do you want to even run the risk? Because even HMS Renown, she's going to have a chance against something like the Giulio Cesare. With her speed, she's going to have a chance, and add in a carrier, and you've got to be worried about that. At Spartivento, Ark Royal's operating 12 Fulmar, 12 Blackburn skewers, and 30 swordfish. That's a fairly decent strike package. Right there. So, yeah. Likely results. Painful. Which leads us to how would the world change? Oh, that's a tough one, honestly. There are all sorts of scenarios. This could have a knock-on impact for the Greece campaign in Crete. It could really affect how much activity the Regia Marina put up, and how that affects convoy operations and resupply of Malta. Because if you've taken out the capital ship corps and damaged heavy cruisers, then their edges, which they use quite often to good effect, and there are several battles where, frankly, the Regia Marina pushed the Royal Navy hard. They pushed them hard. They put up a very tough fight, and they can put up, you know, if you consider, again, Cape Spartivento, the Italians launch a force of 6 heavy cruisers, 14 destroyers, and 2 battleships. The Germans would dream of putting such a task force into an operation it's late in 1940, let alone as time goes on. Especially after Narvik and all the stuff that happened in Norway. They would dream of putting together such a heavy force. I never got to put that sort of kind of force together into one great big task force. And for the Italians, that was a Tuesday. This is what I mean about the Regia Marina being the most overlooked navy on the Axis side. They are really a capable force. But in this scenario, you don't have the Vittorio Veneto. You maybe, at best, if you do have a second ship available, it's the Doria. And there's a reason she's not out with them for Cape Spartivento. She has her own issues. So, yeah, I think the Italian fleet for at least the next year are pretty much knocked out. And that has an impact. If you don't have a major surface threat in the Mediterranean, or rather nothing which is larger than, frankly, an R-class battleship can probably deal with, or HMS Renown could deal with, that's going to affect where you deploy forces. It's going to affect how they're deployed. It's going to affect, what's sent for Force C, what's sent to the Far East as the Taranto. Is going to affect what's at Crete, what takes part in Crete. There's also a scenario that if you've had these 4 carriers deployed to Crete, and if you've got an ongoing scenario of 3 carriers left there, probably do in the Mediterranean, that's going to have an impact on ongoing operations. You see, Eagle pretty much ends up having to be withdrawn for later maintenance, which is why during Crete you are down to just 1 carrier available. Just 1 carrier available. Thanks to damages to Illustrious and all the other things. It's annoying that happens. But you could quite easily have seen 3 carriers continue being there, which means you could have 2 available, and a larger pool of fighters to draw from and to sustain from, and a larger pool of spares to sustain them from. And that's going to have an effect on operations as well. That's going to have a lot of effect on operations. Ultimately, this is going to see a shift in the Mediterranean scenario and what's going on. It might change the focus of the Africa Corps' reinforcement. And the question is, with a far stronger Taranto, does the Italian 10th Army, which is historically routed during Operation Compass, do the Germans manage to get Rommel and the Africa Corps out there as quickly as they did historically? Or do they get intercepted or stopped by the Royal Navy? Is the Royal Navy able to put sufficient surface forces out there to prevent them? Because, after all, where's the heavy escort? Where's the heavy escort that could be useful for getting their convoys across? There are quite a few battles during World War II in the Mediterranean, where you have convoys, east-west convoys, fighting with north-south convoys. And the heavy escorts that the Regia Marina especially runs for these convoys, often proves a decisive capability. Well, without that heavy escort, how does this all change? You don't need to have don't need to change the numbers of convoys getting through that much to cause serious trouble for their own operational capability. And so, if the Africa Corps, if the Italian armies are pushed back that much further after this, and if Crete doesn't fall, and I've talked about videos where Crete doesn't fall, but if you've had this much losses, do you have any amphibious reinforcement from the Italians for Crete? And with the likelihood of there not being any Italian reinforcement, and with other scenarios going on, are the British able to push that much further in Africa? Which means they have that much further forces and they have that much ability. It's a confidence thing, and long wars are an attrition game. Ultimately, we can't really see, because this changes history so much, we can't really see what comes out of it, but it's going to depend on how much the British are able to take advantage of it. Now, I honestly think that the more likely scenario to lead to this scenario is for Courageous and Glorious to not being lost, and for them to be coming through, and for it to be a swordfish strike. Because as much as I would like the Albacores to be ready, as much as I would like Churchill to have wised up about the value of building new carriers a little bit earlier, as much as I would, I think Ark Royal joining this operation rather than doing the Maskrovoka of another strike would have been useful. I see those things still going ahead. Far more. I think the Glorious and Courageous being there, and I think the absolute massive load of swordfish being involved is the most likely scenario. I also could see you at that point at Courageous and Glorious being left in the Mediterranean, because then you can use the newer carriers for dealing with the North Atlantic, and frankly the Mediterranean is a nice place to put those carriers. And if you have Courageous and Glorious sitting out there, as said, I think Crete becomes less likely to fall, and I think all these things start to add up. And I wouldn't be surprised if then when Force Z is being formed up, if they can't spare newer carriers, well, if Courageous and Glorious are still, or either of them are still operational available, they go with Force Z. And they're enough. Honestly, for Force Z, they are enough. But the point is, that goes back to Courageous can't be lost to a torpedo, and Glorious can't be allowed to wander off on her own. Either heading home or doing who knows what. I know there's other ideas about what she could have been doing. From the documents I've read, I'm skeptical. It's an interesting idea, and it's an interesting argument to put forward, but it requires on a lot of people going out of a lot of different chains of command. And the fact is, the Navy at this point is very much not keen on that. And when I say very much not keen on it, I mean they remember what happened in World War I, where such things were taking place, and the trouble and losses it caused. And any officer engaging in that kind of scenario in this time is going to get themselves into trouble with the more senior naval officers and even their juniors. They might think they get glory from the politicians, and I think they'll get appointments, but there are ways. There are always ways. If you start doing these things, there are ways to ensure that you end up in oh yes, of course, he's going to get made a rear admiral of a cruiser squadron in the Indian Ocean, far away from everyone. There are ways. Just look at what happens to poor Harwood, and that was Admiral Harwood. He'd been a Commodore at the Battle of River Plate, then he was a promoted Admiral. And his wasn't even by the Royal Navy. That was done by other service personnel, by the Air Force and the Army, who sheeped all their blame on Harwood because it saved their own skins. It's never a good scenario. Anyway. I always finish videos with a question, and if you've never watched one of my videos before, this might be a surprise, but if you have, you'll know. And basically, my question to you is, what do you think that happens? What do you think? You can go with either Courageous and Glorious have survived, or Ark Royal and Formidable take part in the strike. I'd say a big change if Formidable does take part in the strike is that the Albacore is not going to be... It's going to be seen as the opening career move of the albacore, despite the fact that Swordfish will do the work and the Swordfish will be remembered for it as the star of the show. The albacore will get that ego bump, that image bump, by being part of it, as will the skewer. Both the skewer and the albacore will probably have a very different reputation. The skewer will be remembered as a dive bomber, not as something which was procured as a fighter to get it past the air ministry, but as the dive bomber it was. And the albacore will have had this shining opening chance. And that could change things. It could also, in the nicest way, if the skewer does well and if the albacore does well the bombs, it could make the British more likely to procure a dive bomber earlier. Another dive bomber to follow on from the skewer earlier. But it'd be interesting to see what you think. What do you think the scenario would lead to? What do we have coming? Well, this, if I remember correctly, goes out on the 4th of September. So it's the first week in September. So we've got the Battle of Cadiz coming. Going godly for gold. Ooh, that'll be fun. We've had the Battle of Actium this week as well. This is a packed week, this beginning of September. It really is. Thank you for watching. Take care. Hope you enjoyed. If you liked the video, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. And thank you. Take care. I'm both out of water and I'm brew. This is terrible. I must need to fix this. Definitely a first world problem, but terrible.